Hello, everyone. I'm Dian Griesel, also known as Silver Disobedience, and this is the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast. And today, we're going to be talking with an expert about a topic that I think's on a lot of people's minds. I hear all the time now, and I often think it myself, that my focus sometimes just doesn't seem like what it once was. Is it because I'm older? Well, I certainly am. Is it stress? I don't feel it, but maybe you do. I don't know. Is it the news? Well, that's ever changing, but it's always been changing. What's causing people to feel less focused than at other times in their lives? My guest today is going to help us unlock those secrets and the mysteries of our mind. His name is Dr. Srini Pillay. He's a psychiatrist, a researcher. He helps a lot of companies to understand their employees, their interactions, and how they can do business better. And he's also a technician in the area of brain science and our operating systems, which is what we explore a lot in this podcast. So please welcome Dr. Srini Pillay. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Diane. It's always lovely to talk to you.
I am so excited to talk to you. Let's just get right into it. Do you think there is less focus than at other times, or does it just feel like we're all less focused than we once were?
I definitely think that there's less focus than at other times. I can think one concrete thing I can say is that in the programs that I design for corporations, I've reduced the amount of content to probably at 25% of what I used to present. So I know that the ability to just stay focused on one thing is very difficult for a lot of people. I also think there's been a tremendous amount of research done showing that actually our attentional parameters have actually closed in on us.
Why? What's happening to us?
Well, I think there's a lot of, so there are two sides to this. You know, my last book is about how we can leverage Unfocus. So I don't think Unfocus is all bad. But I do think that in terms of, why, well, a couple of different things. So one of them is digital distractions. Throughout the day, you get up in the morning, you get a notification from your phone, Alexa saying something, you have the TV on, you get a message, you get a text. If you think about this, before mobile devices were around, the brain had real estate that it had to use its real estate well to be able to focus, to carry out tasks. Now we've got to do pretty much the same thing while we're attending to 40 messages that come in 1 minute. And we just take it for granted that that's okay. But when you open up your email box, it's a bit like Russian roulette as well. Right? Because
you don't know what you're going to find.
You have no idea what you're going to find. And as you're thinking about this, you're like, well, this email is okay. This is fine. So the brain is also on high alert because it's not just that there's too much to process. It's also that there's a lot of unknown and a lot of uncertainty.
So are you saying in a way we're in a constant new form of stress, a constant state of stress?
I think so. And I think, the world is changing so much that even at the level of the collective, every day, depending on how you consume news, you are put in a position where you might have to respond to wars, to financial calamities, to political decisions. So I think a lot of people feel like there's an onslaught that's coming their way and that their brains are now getting taken over. And so for most people, they're just trying to keep their lives together. If they're people with families, for example, they're trying to make sure everything's okay at home. They're trying to make sure that they get the work that they need to get done on time. But the work keeps pouring in. And then there's also new stuff. If you think about AI and how AI has changed things, if you're not someone who has jumped into technology, and I have partly because I'm a technology entrepreneur, but also because early on I felt this is not nothing. This is going to change a lot of what's happening. But if you don't dedicate time to new things, you're not going to learn about them. Now, some people are in the privileged position of not having to learn about them, so they don't care. They can read a paper newspaper and they can go for a walk and they can not care about changes in technology. But right now, I used to feel like I was just learning from my Instagram feed or learning about the latest thing that was happening. But now I feel like I have to set aside dedicated time to catch up on the latest developments in AI that are relevant to the work that I do and to my field. So I think, in summary, what I'm saying is there are a lot of distractions, there are a lot of new things, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And those three things are putting our brains at risk. I mean, some people would also say that post-COVID, brain fog has increased for people with long COVID. And then there are people with syndromes like chronic fatigue syndrome, for example, which also seems to be on the increase. And one hard statistic is that ADHD is significantly higher than it ever was. Now, the question is it really higher, or are we just detecting it more, or are we overly detecting it? That can be debated. But I think if you're just looking strictly at that diagnosis, the wait list for diagnosis of ADHD in the UK is in the order of years.
Well, do you think that's because they're on that particular one? Could the wait list to get diagnosed with ADHD go up because you get testing accommodations? And
yes, I
think there's a bit of a scam in that too, which I'm sure you've seen.
Yes, no, I've not only seen the scam in that, I've seen it all over medicine.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of amazing things about the medical system and a lot of ways in which the system serves us, but a lot of messages that reach people are the messages that are best marketed.
I thought how you addressed ADHD in your book, Life Unlocked, was phenomenal. That was one of the most intriguing ways because you tied it into fear.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't realize that in the brain, the fear center, which and the amygdala plays a big role in that, is actually directly connected to the thinking brain, which allows you to focus and pay attention. And so when I used to run the anxiety disorder service at McLean Hospital, which is at Harvard, I used to think to myself, what's going on here? Like, is the primary, because the presenting problem would be, I just can't focus. But when you take a deeper history, you realize this person actually has this chronic worry and a baseline anxiety. And when you have these earthquakes going on in the anxiety center of the brain, it spills over to the thinking brain, and so you can't really attend. And so what I would find is that in certain instances, by treating the anxiety, the attention gets restored. And so I think if you have a problem with attention, it could be a problem with attention, or it could also be a problem with your emotional system that's not cooperating and blasting through your attention.
And can we talk about that? I mean, it's anxiety. You can't scroll through Instagram without seeing the word anxiety. And it's not something I follow. So it's clearly got to be there a lot. I mean, I follow puppies and babies. Right. So I'm like, I don't think I've ever hit on anxiety things. So clearly it's posted a lot. You see people talk about my anxiety. It's almost like it's become a identifier for people. It's clearly up because it's a highly searchable term. And I want to ask you about anxiety. You talked about the dinging going off all the time, which then we answer that, the dopamine drain that could be going on. I want to hear from a medical perspective. Are we draining out our dopamine at a rapid speed each time we respond to one of those dings? And is it elevating anxiety? What's going on?
Well, firstly, anxiety is the commonest mental disorder. So it is. So I don't think you're seeing those things by chance. It actually is.
It is
very,
the most
very
common.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you define anxiety? What's the definition?
Well, so we could get into this in a number of different ways. So there's the diagnostic and statistical.
Your stage.
Well, anxiety is a response to a presumed threat. And I think if you're anxious in the presence of an actual threat, it's not pathological because it's not disrupting your life, it's helping your life. However, if you're anxious and there's no real reason that you're anxious and it starts to disrupt your life, then you're responding to a presumed threat that probably doesn't exist. And that's when anxiety starts to take over people's lives. But I think in the current environment, there's a theory that's called the theory of constructed emotion by Lisa Feldman Barrett, which is a new definition of any emotion. And what she says is emotions are signals that come from the brain telling the body to prepare for what's next expected. So it's basically a metabolic signal that is supposed to be there to help your body say, okay, we need to hold on to our glucose stores. We need to figure out whether we need to feed ourselves, prepare to flee. Now, the issue with anxiety is that it's fine if the signal is correct. But if it's a malfunctioning signal that's like, hey, be careful, which is the message we get. If you look at any news, that's the message that's coming across. So the brain is getting trained to actually create these inaccurate prediction signals that's making everybody feel extremely anxious. And so I often say to people, one short way to think about managing this is a mnemonic that I came up with called CIRCA, which is, so I'll tell you what each letter stands for. The first C is for chunking. The I is for ignore mental chatter. The R is reality check. The second C is control check. And the A is for attention shift. And I'll tell you what each thing means. So the chunking is essentially reminding us that the brain goes into this anxious state when you're flooding it with information, right? Like you get up on a Monday morning, you open your email, you're like, whoa, what just happened? And if you actually tell yourself, let me just take a minute and just chunk out this. I'm going to check email at this time. I'm going to try to figure out what I can get done in the morning, in the afternoon. It might sound silly, but actually the brain starts to calm down once it knows that you don't have to do everything at once, which ties into the second form of chunking, which is basically ruthless prioritizing. So you say to yourself, I'm probably not going to get everything done today, but what do I have to get to? And then the third piece of chunking is delegating. We think we have to do everything ourselves, but actually there are many things we could actually delegate. So that's the chunking. The ignore mental chatter is essentially mindfulness. So it's sitting back in a chair, closing your eyes, paying attention to your breath, and then keeping your attention fixed like a flashlight. And you just observe yourself breathing in and out. Now, that might sound ridiculous, but studies have shown that the amygdala, one of the key parts of the brain involved in anxiety, actually decreases its activation if you engage in a regular practice like this. And
I'm a big believer in that.
Yeah,
I've done that over almost 25 years, and I think it was a lifesaver for me.
Yeah,
actually,
and
almost 40 years.
and actually, there's a technique called cyclic sighing that's recently been studied at Stanford that was actually shown to be superior to mindfulness. And so, if you're someone who says I can't sit in a chair and focus on my breath, then try this. Try breathing in to 3/4, and then you go right to the top, and then you breathe out through your mouth slowly, and you do that for 5 minutes. And it actually helps to reset what's going on in that amygdala. Also, this practice that you're talking about is actually something that can protect genes. So at the end of our genes, we have telomeres, which get shorter and shorter as we get older, and when we get illnesses, and then we die. But Elizabeth Blackburn, who got the Nobel Prize in Medicine, in her preliminary studies found that you might actually be able to protect those telomeres. So ignore mental chatter has a lot of benefits. Then reality check is simply self-talk, which is this too shall pass. Those days there's no silver lining, there's nothing, you just can't see the good in the disaster that just unfolded in front of you. But what we often forget, and the brain forgets this, is that this will pass.
Yes.
Think about any adversity you've experienced in your life. When you're experiencing it, it's like it's going to last forever. But if you remind your brain, this actually is going to pass.
We were talking about the ocean earlier. I always try to think of it as, it might feel like it's coming in like a tsunami, but it goes out.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And then there's control check, which is basically the serenity prayer. What can I control? What can I not control? Do I know the difference? Lady Gaga is a great example of someone who actually used this on her own. She was talking to students at Yale, and she said, I reached a point in my career where I was just totally burnt out, and I didn't want to sing anymore. People were like, what do you mean? Like, you're like such an amazing singer, and you got such a huge fan base. She said, I just realized that I didn't want to do what I was expected to do. I didn't want to take selfies. I had more to offer the world. I didn't want to sell perfumes. I don't even like perfumes. And so eventually I'd go home and I'd look at myself in the mirror because I would say no to some things. And I would say, I can sleep with any day because you have integrity. You're standing for what you believe in. And it's kind of an amazing wake-up call to what can I control? What can I say no to? And if I'm not going to control something, why do I want to fill my brain with all kinds of nonsense that has nothing to do with who I am. And then the last A is attention shift, which is we get stuck in the problems, but we rarely shift early enough into solutions. So how do we take the brain's attentional system? People will go on about, oh, this just happened politically, or this just happened. It's like, well, okay, so we've identified it's a problem for you. What's your solution? Because if we spend more time, even if we don't know the answer, if we spend more time, and that's where the unfocused mind can help, actually, trying to figure it out, the answers often arrive. The answers are not always sought after by the brain and caught. Sometimes there's an intelligence in waiting. And so basically, just to round off that idea, there is a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of uncertainty, and by using a technique like CIRCA, you can use that every Monday, whenever you're in a high-pressure situation, at the beginning of each day. You can use some of the steps, not all of the steps, but you can know that if you use any of those steps, you will change your brain for the better if you're feeling anxious.
I would totally believe that, because it gives someone a sense of control. And if we,
Right.
often that anxiety is triggered because someone's feeling everything's out of their control. So if you can immediately say, well, I can chunk my day, I
Yes.
can look at, divide it into what I can do and what I can't do. Look at those priorities. I know I drive everyone in my house nuts because they'll say, Mom, what's happening? They'll talk about something 3 weeks from now. And I always think I'm on an as need to think about it basis.
Right.
There's enough I'm thinking about now. When I need to think about it, I never miss anything,
Right.
but I'm not going to spend much time thinking about it until I have to.
Yeah. No, absolutely. If you fill your brain with all the stuff that you have to do, you probably will just go to sleep and not want to get up.
Yeah.
It's but to this point about the unfocus, the reason I wrote Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try was because I wanted people to recognize that there is a focused brain that can be helped when you address emotions using techniques like CIRCA, but there's a part of your brain that only turns on when you unfocus. It's called the default mode network. We used to think of it as the do mostly nothing network, the DMN, because people would be like, yeah, this network only lights up when somebody's not focusing. And they were like, well, what could possibly be the use of not focusing? Well, it turns out that this is one of the most intelligent circuits in our brains. And a lot of people live their days with focus, fatigue, and then they're out for the count. But they don't spend time strategically unfocusing. And
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
Srini, you just have resolved something that has fascinated me. I recently was unloading, just kind of clear stuff out of our house. And I found all these notebooks from our son from calculus, his junior year of high school. And I'm looking at these and I'm seeing all these formulas that are making me break into a sweat because I don't remember calculus at all. I'm not even sure I took it. It looks like Greek to me.
Right.
But on every other page, there are these elaborate graffiti drawings.
Right.
And drawings on every page in between the calculus
Yes.
formulas and everything else. And I'm like, how did this kid ever do so well in calculus?
Well-
and now you're pointing out that maybe it was because he was doodling.
Well, doodling can actually improve memory by 29%.
Really?
So
What?
So-
Why is that?
Well, partly is your brain is, metaphorically speaking, if you're all tense and you're focused, your brain is like a stiff sponge. It's not going to absorb information. But if you relax into something enough, you begin to absorb information. So doodling, the studies have been initially that it improves memory by 29%. Then people said, well, actually, you should be doodling about something that's relevant to the material. So for any fact I state, there's always a counterfact. I think it depends on the individual, and it depends on whether that works for you. But doodling is a form of unfocus that I talk about in Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try. And what I explain is that this circuit, the default mode circuit in the brain, the default mode network, is actually a network that is responsible for abstraction, for processing complexity. So when you've got 10,000 things you have to figure out how to bring together and you don't know how to do that, your focus network is not the network to turn to. It's the reason you have some of your best ideas in the shower is because that's when you're unfocusing. Right? And so, and it's also called the crystal ball of the human brain because it's the part of your brain that's responsible for prediction. And I have so many thoughts about this because I just did
Let's hear some because it's fascinating. The part of our brain that's the crystal ball.
That's
I think
responsible.
everyone would like to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, I mean, if you're a fund manager or you're someone who's trying to predict things in stocks, if you focus all day, but you don't have these periods of unfocus, you're not activating the crystal ball of your human brain. And so you're not actually allowing your brain to go into prediction mode. And it's those people who've learned how to focus, unfocus, what I call cognitive rhythm. Focus, unfocus. Those are the people who learn how to use their brains best. You know, Albert Einstein said that his discovery was a musical perception. It wasn't a logical perception. He found it in a musical way, and then he was able to derive the logic. So what I say to people is, if you're one of those people who says, no, I've got to focus to get stuff done, well, it turns out we actually spend close to 50% of our days with our minds wandering. Our minds need to wander to figure out who we are. You know, if you were your LinkedIn profile, then focus would be fine. But everybody knows whatever your LinkedIn profile is doesn't describe who you are. And it doesn't describe what it feels like to be with you. So what we know about focus is that it can drain energy from the brain. So there was a study done that looked at people who were focusing on a video and people who were just watching it as usual. And at the end of that time, they gave them a dilemma. You know, who would you save in this particular situation? The people who were focusing couldn't care less. They were like, let them all die. Like, I don't have the energy. And then when they fed them glucose, they started to care again. So when your brain is drained, you can't even care about anything. And so focus is problematic in that way. It's also problematic when you don't pay attention to what's going on around you. You know, like Anne Wang, who discovered the word processor, was so focused on version number 2, he didn't notice that the PC was making an entrance into the market.
Right.
And so he was focused, but not paying attention to what was around him. And it's the same thing with not being able to, if you're focused with your nose to the grindstone, you're not paying attention to upcoming trends. All of a sudden, you're sideswiped. Your job is gone. You're like, what happened? Well, you were not paying attention to what was around you. Also, when you want to innovate, you usually have to join 1 or 2 points. And so if your focus is just 1 point, and it turns out that you do have a self, a kind of self, which is the embodied self, which is served by the focus network, which is like, you know, when you're in the zone, or when you watch a tennis player, just sort of like they're like perfectly tense and relaxed. And you're like, yeah, that's an amazing thing. But the unfocused circuit is the part of your brain that is responsible for getting together the puzzle pieces to be like, this is who I am. And, you know, we evolve all the time, and we are constantly changing who we are. And in fact, I think it's to our advantage if we can change the arrangement of these puzzle pieces. But something has to put it together. And if you're focused all the time, the pieces are just going to be scattered in your brain. It's like, I don't know what happened. You know, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've seen over the course of my life who are brilliant, highly accomplished. The whole world admires them, kinds of people who are like, I don't know what happened in the last 20 years. I honestly don't know. I feel like I was so focused on solving this world problem that I never picked my head up. And now I'm thinking, what happened in my life? And, you know, some people have been in extreme distress about that. So I always like to remind people that unfocus is helpful to your brain. And there are ways you can do this. You can do this, you know, either by taking a booster break. So instead of working the whole day, 15 minutes, go on a brisk walk or a run.
I always think of how I've read a lot of Thomas Edison biographies, and he would work, said he really never slept any extended periods, but he would work for 3 to 5 hours and take a 5 to 20-minute nap and then work. And he often said sometimes he wasn't even sure he was napping. He was just not thinking is how he described it, which is, I guess, you know, today we would call it meditating or getting into that zone.
Right. Or strategic unfocus. You know,
strategic unfocus.
Which, activating the default mode network in your brain. You know, because so things like booster breaks can help. There's a type of daydreaming that actually helps. It's called positive constructive daydreaming. And it was first studied by Jerome Singer in the 1950s. And what he found was that it doesn't help to sit at your desk and just daydream. And it doesn't help to remember the prior night's indiscretions. Like, oh my God, what did I say at the party? I shouldn't have had that much to drink. I'm not sure why did I handle it that way? But what does help is positive, constructive daydreaming. And to do this, just 3 steps. Number 1, you have to be doing something low key. Like if knitting is your thing, then knitting, or gardening, or going for a walk, but not stationary. Your body has to be moving. And then what you do is you take your mind, we spend our whole days perceiving, right? Everything is looking outward. We don't spend time going inwards. And that's what imagination is about. So in that time, whether it's, if you can start with 5 minutes and build up to 20 minutes, if you can just then turn that attentional apparatus inward, and you imagine something wishful or joyful, like lying on a yacht, or lying on the beach, or running through the woods with your dogs, you actually activate circuits in your brain that enhance creativity, and you're basically relaxing the focus part of the brain. You were asking earlier, like, why are we not focused? Well, because we're focusing too much. Why don't we actually take this time to allow to activate our full intelligence,
Right.
so that we can get to a place where we're harnessing everything that we have. I think one of the biggest tragedies that I see in human psychology is that people do not listen to themselves. They listen to everything else.
True.
They listen to the news. They listen to someone else's opinion. But when they have a hunch, they're like, nah, I don't know why I'm having that hunch. But hunches are there for a reason. And if you took a little of that unfocused time and you didn't think about anything, but you just tried to think about that, I guess I am learning about.
If I think back of anything I might have called a mistake in my life, I had some kind of gut instinct that I ignored. There
Right.
was something that made me question it, but I rationalized it. My rational brain just came in and said no, or my forceful personality said, I'm going to handle this. But there was some instinct. I'm
Right.
such a believer in listen to that instinct. And we've also talked about hypnosis. When you
Right.
talk about visualizing something, it's why I love, the concept of hypnosis, because you're giving, that visual that you can give someone that maybe can't get to it themselves.
Yeah, and a lot of times, what people don't realize about the power of visualization from a biological standpoint is there's a condition where people can't imagine.
Really?
It's called aphantasia. Yeah, so they just cannot imagine. But if you look in their brains, the visual parts of their brains are working. So people are like, well, why? What's happening? Well, what's happening is that the other senses are not joining. So the vision doesn't have any life. So if, for example, you wanted to visualize living in a bigger house, and you were thinking to yourself, okay, I want to visualize this. Now, people would say, well, that's ridiculous. Like, what do you think? You're just going to manifest it? It's like, no, you're creating a blueprint for your brain. You're helping your brain out. You're basically saying to your brain, this is what I want. And then your brain doesn't have to say, well, he or she doesn't know what they actually want. But then it's important to allow the feelings to come in of like, what would it feel like when I'm sitting in that movie theater in my house? Like, it would be so cool. What would it feel like having popcorn with my friends over? What would it feel like just knowing that I don't have to get up one more day and worry about how to make ends meet? What would it feel like? You have to put the feeling in.
There's such power in that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine not being able to imagine, because years ago, I had said to myself, if I could make it through my first 2 years in a business I started, and I was saving every dime. I mean, if I made it, I saved it. I was turning orange from eating too many carrots. But I said, if I make it through, I had pictures of these mansions. Don't ask me why I wanted a mansion. Probably because I was living in a studio apartment about the size of the table we're sitting at. But I wanted a mansion with property, and it had to be a mansion.
Right.
And I had pictures of them. My mother even used to send me pictures of mansions and say, Diane, if anyone's going to get this, you're going to figure out a way. Well, I ended up buying Alice Cooper's mansion at one point.
That's incredible.
Up in upstate New York. Didn't keep it long because I found out that mansions come with huge gas bills,
Right.
electric bills, and lawn maintenance bills.
Right.
But I got that mansion.
Well, it is amazing.
But it was that visualizing aspect. What is it that triggers in our brain when we use our imagination like that?
Well, when you're using your imagination, you're actually starting to create a blueprint, but you're also, if it's real for you, you're involving yourself in that goal, right? It's not like there are all kinds of
Yeah, I
philosophical
knew I had to work for it.
Right. But
Right.
So a lot of people stay in a state of desire. But what desire does paradoxically is it separates you from your goal. You're always wanting the
Can
thing.
you repeat that? That's
Desire.
a good point.
Desire often separates people from their goals. Like, I want a mansion, and people stay in this hope state, which is different from I want a mansion, and then the mansion becomes part of your intrinsic brain architecture. It's literally it's a figure that's a blueprint in your brain, and then you start to own it. And when you start to own it, you are no longer separate from what the thing is.
So how do you define desire? Because you tied desire in there. So I'm curious what desire means.
Well, I was thinking about it in that particular context from the perspective of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and
Okay.
and also from the perspective of a discussion I had the other day with Thomas Hubel, who is an amazing human being. We were talking about time and the future, and he was saying, well, you know what? So I'm very much a believer in the block theory of time, which is that the past, present, and future don't actually exist.
I believe that too.
Einstein.
I don't know why I believe it, but I feel it every day.
That actually they're continuous, and the brain has to figure out how to make stuff work. So we divide everything into past, present, future, and we make it exist. But it's not an intrinsic property of the universe. Well, one of the things that I loved about what Thomas said was he said, well, what people think is that the future is somewhere else. Like the house you want is somewhere else. And if it's somewhere else, it's going to be somewhere else. He said what they don't realize is that they've got to dial into a higher state of consciousness to bring the future into the here and now. And so dialing into that consciousness means when you're visualizing that, you're getting into a state of belief. You're increasing your dopamine, you're decreasing your stress hormones, you're actually activating reward centers that give you the motivation to pursue what you need in order to get there. There was a really cool study done that looked at the impact. Some people would say, well, what's all this hope, schmope? It sounds ridiculous. Well, consider this experiment. There was a neutral paste that they gave people, but they put it into 3 different tubes and they labeled them differently.
Paste?
Paste, just like a paste that you put in your skin.
Okay.
One they labeled lidocaine, but it wasn't lidocaine. The other they labeled capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili. And the third, they just said neutral. So when people expected lidocaine, they put it and they were like, wow, this is kind of relieving. And you looked in their brains and the reward center was activated by the belief that this was lidocaine, because it was not lidocaine. If you then look at the people who had the capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili, they were like, oh, this stings a little. Like, what is this? And the pain centers were activated. And nothing happened in the brains of people who had the neutral paste, which indicated that in life, you can change your brain based on what you expect.
I have seen for over almost 30 years now. I've analyzed clinical trial results for biotechnology companies to come up with the messaging based on the results. And as you, as a medical researcher and doctor, could say even more so probably than what I've seen, even though I've probably, like no exaggeration, probably looked at 2,000 clinical trials, the placebo effect is the most wild thing that can happen in a clinical trial, where all the people who didn't get that cancer medication are all of a sudden feeling a heck of a lot better than the ones who did. And it's mind-blowing.
No, it is, and it's such a controversial area in medicine because I really believe in the placebo effect, but I also believe in the nocebo effect.
Yes,
which is
explain that for everyone because it's so important.
If you expect something negative to happen, it's probably going to happen.
Yep.
There's another good example of this placebo type effect, which is ghrelin which is the hunger hormone. They gave people milkshakes, and they told one group, you're getting a 600-calorie milkshake, and they told the other group the truth, which is that they were getting a 300-calorie milkshake. Well, the 600-calorie people got full really quickly, and you look at their hunger hormones, and it dropped because they expected to get full, and so they changed their own biology. So I'm a huge believer in being attentive to the energy that we're carrying around us. And I think what you're telling me about the visualization, and it wasn't just any mansion, it was Alice Cooper's mansion.
It was a really cool mansion.
Right. and somehow
built in 1917 by Buster Brown.
Yeah,
which you might not remember, but it was the biggest shoe company when I was little. Everyone wanted a pair of Buster Brown shoes.
Well, it makes sense to me because I think you embody some of what Alice Cooper is
in my dreams.
You do in the daring.
Yeah, I'm 18 and I don't know what I want.
I'm sort of like that all the time. I'm completely in denial of age.
It's one of the things I love about you.
I refuse to think about it. I mean, people are like, "What?" I was thinking, no, I'm proud of it. You go ahead and be proud of whatever you want to be proud of. I do not want to fall into conditioned ways of thinking.
Yes.
And, studies have shown that if you fall into these conditioned ways of thinking and you're like, no, well, I'm 70, I'm 80, you have to slow down now. Those people slow down more than people of the same age who are not thinking that. So, it's one thing to say, I'm reality testing and I know what my age is. There's obviously value to that. But I think we don't need to fall into patterns of behavior that society forces us to think about.
It's so funny you say that because I'll talk to people and they'll say, yeah, I'm in my 60s. Of course, things are starting to fall apart. And I'm like, I'm in my 60s and I feel like I'm just getting started. I needed all that energy to start to build up to get me to this point. I have no idea if I'm going to combust tomorrow, but I never knew that when I was 30 either.
No, who's going to said youth is wasted in the young?
Yeah,
right?
And I think they were right. Another thing you said that I thought was so funny. A few years ago, one of my kids said, Mom, could you stop telling me this is healthy and good for me? He goes, I just like it. But when you say that, I almost don't want to eat it.
Right. I'm similar. If you go deep down into studies, you've looked at clinical trials, so you know as well as I do that there is so much more complexity to what things actually are than people talk about. I think I've mentioned this to you once before. When I look at the studies on good cholesterol, and I find medicine really funny because medicine, in a sense, is a representation of science, which historically has been separated from the ethos of religion. But the terminology has made its way right into medicine. Good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Let's judge the cholesterol. High blood pressure, low blood pressure. Let's use ranking systems for your blood pressure. When in fact, if you actually look at what we call good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, the effects are more complex. There have been lots of studies that show that bad cholesterol could be bad. But there are also a large number of meta-analyses that show that if you lower bad cholesterol, you may die sooner.
Exactly. I mean, I never understood the cholesterol thing, and I've worked with many companies that have done it just plain on the fact of every cell in your body needs cholesterol to make. Why do you want to reduce what makes cells?
Right.
And it's essential to the structure of a cell.
Yeah. So is there some way that we can understand
differently?
I think the next era of my life, I'm very interested in figuring out how to present complexity to the public so that you don't just go on a podcast and be like, oh my God, you're right. I should be eating more antioxidants. So let me eat more broccoli. Well, I like broccoli. I think it's great. But there are studies that show that antioxidants can also accelerate cancer cell development if they're already in you. So it's nothing is just have more and you'll get better. Everything is judging, intuiting, being in tune with your body. Looking at medical research, and I love medical research because I think it's better than witchcraft. So I think I like the idea of looking at data, but I don't think that what you see is what you get when you look at data.
I agree. I think data, I always think of Trident chewing gum that always said 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Trident chewing gum. And I'm thinking, okay, so you started Trident chewing gum. You could have 4 sons or daughters or sons and daughters that are all dentists.
Right.
And are they going to go against your chewing gum?
Totally.
No. Right. But maybe that 5th person you asked thought, no, chewing gum is bad for your teeth.
No, always. I often say that, they always talk about conflicts of interest in
Okay.
studies.
That's a whole other story.
I would
We could
love-
really get into that one, Srini.
Well, I would love it if all the studies that say that vegetables are all you should eat, I would love to know what the study investigators are eating. And the same thing for
Yeah.
if meat is all you can eat, I want to know what the study investigators are saying. Because I can tell you, I would not conduct a study that showed that you should not eat steak because I like it. Now,
Exactly.
And so it's your
we all
bias.
enter with a form of a bias or a prejudice to the end result.
Right. And so I think it's good for the public. I don't think it's good to be paranoid about it or to be afraid of it, but I think to give yourself permission to ask questions and to explore things for yourself and turn on that default mode network and go for that walk so you can say, when I put two and two together, I think I want to do this, that, or that. Someone once said to me, if you had to give me some, like, your greatest piece of sage advice, what would that be? I would say, life is short. Just make it worth it for yourself. Too many people realize this with their last breaths, and they don't realize that they've been spending their whole lives worrying about something that was pointless.
I talk about death a lot, and it's such an important subject to me because it's so intimately related to life. And when people get to be 50, they so often say, "Oh, I'm at my halfway mark." Well, how many 100-year-olds do you know? And 100-year-olds that you'd want to be.
Right.
Or I think I live my life by you never know when the second half began.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and what's interesting about worry, if you look at the leading theory of like why people worry, it's kind of disappointing because it's a little bit boring, but it's also interesting. It's called the contrast avoidance theory. And what people have found was that in life you have peak experiences, having a child, getting a great job, having a great meal, and then you have these trough experiences, which is like losing important people in your life or losing a job. Worried people keep themselves in the miserable middle. They have to keep themselves in the miserable middle because they're afraid of the contrast between, I just had a great meal yesterday and someone died tomorrow. They don't want to have that swing. But if they're mildly miserable, when they get the bad news, they're prepared for it. And so I always say to people, make a point of deliberately adding some high-level event to your week so that you know that you're not spending your time in this miserable middle trying to just stay there because you're afraid of that contrast. From an anxiety perspective, one of my favorite quotes is that of Kierkegaard, who said, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." Humans say that they want.
I never heard that, and that's a good one. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom.
That everybody says they want to be free, but the moment you contemplate that, you're like, no, I can't be free. I would go crazy. I'd go wild. I'd lose everything that I had. And so people choose balls and chains to add to their lives because they're afraid of that freedom. And so what I say is, of course, you don't want a wild life that completely disrupts your life. But you can navigate toward a place of building degrees of freedom into your life. And the more you can embrace that, and the more you can realize that anxiety is a signal knocking on the door saying, "Hey, watch out. You sure you want to be free?" And then you're like, no. I think I'd rather just be anxious. I'll just be anxious so that I can never be free. It's a contrast that Freud actually sort of commented on this and said, people come to me complaining about their worry and their anxiety, and you try to take their worry away from them. It's like taking a cub away from a lioness. They're like, I want that worry.
Yeah.
I want my worry. And it's like,
like people identify with it. It becomes their identity.
Right.
Who would I was talking to someone the other day, and oh my gosh, I don't want this discussion to end, but we're getting close. But I'd love your last thoughts on this, because I said to her, the person, I'll leave them, right. The person, I said, I often ask people, who would you be if you stopped telling that story?
Absolutely. Yes, and the self is much more malleable, changeable than we realize. There's a phenomenon that I sort of call psychological Halloweenism, which is
oh my gosh, we probably should have started with that. That's an episode into itself.
Well, it was
psychological Halloweenism,
which is based on a study that showed that if I give you a creative problem to solve, and if you take on the identity of a rigid librarian, you are statistically significantly less likely to solve it than if you take on the identity of an eccentric poet. And what that tells us is that our inability to solve problems is not because we don't have the mental capacity, but because we're stuck in a version of ourselves that cannot solve that problem. And so you want to put yourself into a different identity to give your brain permission to think in different ways. I mean, this is why people have said that psychedelics are helpful. They put the brain on pause. They disrupt the neural patterns that describe your identity so that you have this complete rearrangement of neurons. Now, of course, there are lots of caveats. The trials need to show that they're effective. They need to.
That's a whole other show.
Story, right? Yeah. But I do think that we are frequently limit our lives because we are committed to our frozen identities. And I think if we can recognize that you don't need to wait for a certain age to change something. If you're curious about something, try it. It can be as simple as recently I feel like my life was transformed because I had been denying how much I love jump rope. And I was like, I saw someone on Instagram like using this with music and dancing. And I was like, wait a minute. This is like, why have I not had this in my life for like however many years? I want it back in my life. And it's such a silly example, but there's so many things like that where you realize that if you can just, I think we've talked about this before, like, I'm constantly falling in love and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Like, it's sort of at some point you're like, what is this feeling? And Thomas
wonderful.
He had some wisdom about this. Actually, Thomas, when I was talking to him, said, I think you would be less concerned about this if you just made a distinction between merger, which creates torture, and transcendence, which frees you. And if you recognize that your falling in loveness is about realizing that you are not alone, that you are fundamentally connected to all humans, it will open the door to a transcendent gateway of your actual identity, which is not solitary.
Oh my gosh, I don't want to end this, but that's a really good note to end on. And we did talk about falling in love. And I told you about the painting that I have that says I fall in love at least twice a day.
Right.
Because I think it's a wonderful thing. And I do think of it as transcending.
Yes.
But oh my gosh, Dr. Srini Pillay, this just went too fast.
It did.
But boy, I appreciated your time today because I know you're busy. And everyone, this has been a great episode. So I know you're going to want to share it with your friends. You're going to want to hit subscribe. We have been recording in Manhattan Center. My guest has been Dr. Srini Pillay. Mwah.
Thanks so much for having me, and to you as well.
And you can find out all about him in the links below. I highly suggest you check out his website, look up any of his books. Every single one is an eye-opener, and you're going to learn a lot. So thank you. Thanks for joining me. Hit subscribe, share this with your friends, and thank you, Dr. Palle.
Thanks so much for having me, Dian.